مباركة أعظم البركات يا والدة الإله العذراء، فإن الجحيم قد سبي بالمتجسد منك، وآدم دعيا ثانيا. مبارك أنت أيها المسيح لنا، الذي هكذا ارتضى المجد لنا. نسبحك نباركك نسجد لك نمجدك نشكرك لأجل عظيم جلال مجدك. يا إلهي يا ربي يا ضابط الكل يا رب عزا وحيدا.
Born in Palestine to a humble beginning, Christianity took root in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, and gradually spread across the world. Christians have lived continuously throughout the Middle East since the day of Pentecost, more than 2,000 years ago. They are the descendants of those early followers of Christ, their roots firmly based in the culture and traditions of the land. Yet few are even aware of their existence. The story of the Palestinian Christians is often drowned in the turmoil of events and overshadowed and neglected. An integral part of the fabric of Palestinian society, they have shared in the events of recent decades in the history of the Palestinian people. There are many dates of great significance, the most momentous of all, Saturday, November 29th, 1947. On that day, the nations of the world sat down at the United Nations to vote on Resolution 181 to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Zionist movement and the Jewish Agency mounted one of the most remarkable lobbying campaigns in history. They lobbied America and President Truman, and Truman lobbied the world. It was afternoon in New York when the voting began. The vote lasted only 3 minutes.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. United States, yes.
The resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
By the time the session was over, it was past midnight in Palestine. The Palestinians lost their homeland in their sleep. According to Resolution 181, Palestinians had to give up more than half of their land for the creation of the Jewish state.
They did that to us because they were convinced that a land without a people belongs to a people without a land. This is what Theodor Herzl has written in his famous booklet, Neu Alt Land, the New Old Land. And then they found so many people, they wanted to get rid of them. It's very shocking to compare what they have endured to what they made others endure. Yeah?
Archbishop Elias Shakur, in his Christian village of Kfir Biram, suffered the same fate as hundreds of other Palestinian communities. The people of Kfar Biram, a village in the northern Galilee, watched warily as wave after wave of refugees fled towards the Lebanese border, just a few kilometers away. The farmers of Biram had a tough decision to make: join the refugees before Israeli troops came to them, or stay in their homes and take their chances. This small community of Palestinians decided to stay.
We were very simple peasants who believed that violence begets violence. Everybody in the village was like a family member. We were all brothers and sisters for each other.
On October 29, 1948, the Israeli army captured the village. The capture of Kfar Biram was part of a larger military campaign called Operation Broom, intended to sweep Palestinians out of the Galilee.
الظهر تقريبا كانت الجيش مطوق البلد وقال كله بيجي على الكنيسة. أنا رحت حافي وأوعي خليتهم حد اللجأ حد الدستر مي مشان أتحمم.
إجا حاكم العسكري وأنا بالدار نادى علي نزلت لعنده. اللي بدك تجمع لي تقول للمختير والخوارني يجوا لهون. لما إجوا قال لهم إنه لازم تطلعوا من البلد. معكم 48 ساعة. شو بتقدروا تقيموا بتقيموا أغراضكم واللي بلاقيه بالبلد بقتله.
I never forget the day of the expulsion because I walked 4 to 5 kilometers under raining when I was 10 years old. I have some small goats, babies, and they used to walk with me, but some of them were unable to continue. I am sorry for that I left two. Most of them I saved them and I saved myself.
I was around 9 years. I remember the day when we received the orders from the army to leave. This order was issued 10 days after the army arrived to the village, and they lived in our homes while we stayed on the roofs of the houses.
We left everything in the village, everything in our houses. We took only our keys with us, you know.
The army told the people of Kfar Biram to evacuate the village for 2 weeks and move 5 kilometers to the north. In other words, go to Lebanon and join the swollen ranks of the refugees there. But they didn't listen. They walked to the nearest hill and stayed inside caves and under trees, waiting for the army to allow them to return home.
I went from home, carried a blanket on my back as a little boy, and went to the other side of the village, the other hill there, mountain, and we stayed there under the olive trees for 2 weeks.
After 1 week of exile, Kfar Biram suffered its first casualties. 7 children died as a result of the freezing winter temperatures in the hills of the Galilee. 10 days later, the army ordered them to move again, this time 4 kilometers south to the nearby village of Jish. What could the cold, hungry, and defenseless people do? They obeyed, and Jish became their unwanted exile. Jish was living its own trauma. Half of the village's inhabitants had fled, either to other Palestinian communities or to Lebanon. In Jish, they found refuge in the homes of an already uprooted people.
For every refugee from Biram who went to Jish, he knows that he is living in the house of another refugee who is uprooted in Lebanon. We know the people, they are houses of other Palestinian refugees. And to take their lands, it was also emotionally difficult for us.
أنا وحياة أمي ما لناش بيت نسكن فيه. في بنت خالتها عندها خش مترين على 280 على 180 متر. أنا هي سيحانة من متر. سكننا فيها.
In Jish, the abandoned homes and whatever tents they could assemble weren't enough to provide everyone shelter. So they asked the Israeli army for some tents. The army told them there was no need for tents and assured them that they would soon return to Kfar Biram. So they sat and waited.
The heads of families gathered again and came back. It was only 15 minutes walk to see the officer of the army who want to return our wife and children.
كان حاكم العسكري اسمه مانو فريدمان. اجا مانو قال لهم التصريح تبعكم يا بجبتي. قالوا اللي بده يصلح البيت بده كذا بيقدر يطلع يصلح بيته بترجعوا على البلد. بكره بالكثير بعد بكره بترجعوا على البلد.
أنا حملنا اللي بنقدر عليه على حمارة وجينا على برعم. وفي كان ناس إلهم شقف أرض قريبة على البلد أخذوا البقرات وصاروا يفلحوا.
Instead of giving them the permit, the army had another plan for the farmers of Biram.
Suddenly, the army came and the police collected them in trucks and took them to the police station in Safad.
خلونا بصفاد لعتمت الدنيا ومتنا واحنا مرميين بصفاد. اجا قال يلا كلكم بيطلعوا على السيارة. اطلعوا على السيارات. طلعنا على السيارات.
They were loaded onto military trucks like cattle and driven to the faraway city of Nablus in the West Bank.
معنا أولاد صغار ومعنا ختيرية ومعنا نسوان كبيرة. أنطونا الصليب الأحمر أعاشي يعطونا كل يوم رغيف وشقف يعطونا. بعدين شو بدنا نسوي نحن النسوان؟ قالوا بدهم يروحوا يشحدوا. رحنا على نابلس. أنا رحت شحدت.
After this, they were able to beg to get some money from begging, and they hired a truck to Amman.
ركبنا بالشحن وأجينا من نابلس لعمان. أخذونا على كنيسة اللاتين. كان المسؤول بطران اسمه حنا السمعان. قلنا له هيك يكسبنا. قال بكرة الحد بنصلي على نيتكم وإن شاء الله بتتسهلوا. ضبلنا بالكنيسة 10 ليرات ونص فلسطيني. أخذ سيارة فيهم من عمان لصور. سيارة شحن. فتنا بالشام بالليل وجينا هون على هاي رشايا الفخار كانت مليانة ثلج وطالعة بس الدخنة من الروازن تبعت البيوت. وشو موت وسقى. ضلينا الشوفير قال لي أنا للصبح أقدر أمشي. قعدنا بالسيارة للصبح وقفنا حالنا من السقى والثلج. صرنا على صور. هذا منظر أنا بنسوش. شفنا جبل الجرمة قلنا الحمد لله هاي بلادنا.
Some refugees managed to find their way back, but most did not.
And they were stuck and became the Palestinian refugees in the Arab countries. Very few were able to infiltrate back, and among them was my father. This is how we knew what happened to them.
Those who made it back to Jish were happy to be closer to home, but there was nothing at home to be happy about. Israel had just confiscated the land of Kfar Biram. The uprooted people of Biram were farmers. Their livelihood and survival depended on the land. Without land to farm, without work, without freedom of movement, the people of Biram were desperate.
I remember when a certain Jew, we didn't know where from he was coming, he came to the village where we became refugees. He wanted to hire people to work for him on our fields. And the first year I accompanied my father and mother from Jish to our own fields of figs. And they were collecting the figs that they planted. I never saw their eyes dry the whole day. They were always crying. I know they were praying. And they were praying and asking God, what have we done to be reduced to a daily salary in our own field?
موسم الزيتون تروح بالسرقة، هي تحوشها وتطلع حواليك، إذا في حدا بوليس كذا كذا دي مسكك، واللي مسكوه محكمة عسكرية بني آدم، محكمة عسكرية مسكوا واحدة من عنا كانت تحوش زيتون، أخذوها عصفت. قال للحاكم أنت طلعتي من منطقة مسكرة وفتي على منطقة مسكرة ورجعتي من منطقة مسكرة لمنطقة وسرقتي زيتون. صفنت المرأة قدام الحاكم قالت له والله يا سيدي أنا مش سراقة، أنا لو بدي أسرق سرقت من أرض اليهود، أنا هذول الزيتونات زرعهم أبوي وجدي، حرام علي أروح أجيب 10 كيلو زيتون أطعمي أولادي.
لما جينا لهون على الجيش قعدنا بالجيش، قعدنا مدة وعرفنا إنه خلص ما فيش نتيجة من بعد ما كبوهم. قمنا جمعوا شوية مصاري من أهل البلد ونزلوا وقفوا محامي ونزلوا فرفعوا عليهم قضية بمحكمة العدل العليا.
The people of Biram had had enough. It had been 3 years since the army promised them that they could return to their village, so they decided to take their case to court. For the next 2 years, they had to battle laws and regulations designed to drive them away from their homes and their land. In 1953, the Israeli Supreme Court issued its ruling.
The decision of the Supreme Court that you have the right to go back to your village, but provided that you get a permission from the military commander of the area.
The army, however, refused to give them permission.
لما قالوا بنرجع بلدهم بالفعل وما رجعوا ما قبلوش خلونا نرجع، اتفقنا ببعضنا البعض هون بالبلد انه ثاني يوم بالليل كنا ناويين احنا نرجع بالقوة.
Despite the army's refusal to allow them to return, the farmers were determined to go home. They went to bed that night full of hope their exile would end the following day. But the next day, the Israeli Air Force bombed Biram before the villagers could get there. Alarmed by the sound of bombs, they scrambled hysterically up a high hill on the outskirts of Jish and watched as their homes were destroyed.
طلعنا على قبال البلد في تل بتطل على البلد، كانت ساعة سوداء، كانت ساعة سوداء لما قعدوا فجروا البيوت مشان يقطعوا لنا الأمل ما نرجعش. قلنا لهم عمي مش ممكن، احنا مناش البيوت، بدنا بس الأرض نحط خيام ونسكن بس نرد على بلدنا.
كل البرامج كانوا على البيادر والخوري والكل وصلاة وإشي وتشوف هي طاخ تفجر والدخنة تطلع، هذا كله نشوفوه من هون. أما من هناك احنا وقفنا قريب على البلد نشوفها كيف توطي الطيارة وتضرب ونشوف كيف تفجر البيوت، ما خلوش إشي.
في أصعب من اللي بيطلعك من بيتك وأرضك ويهدي لك بيتك كمان وأنت الإرهابي. هاي الله قالها، أي الله قال.
There was a sense of indignation, of disgust, of so many questions. Why? How come? There was even a question of, are we guilty? What have we done to deserve that? Yeah.
The story of Biram is similar to that of hundreds of other Palestinian villages. Some were left for nature to reconquer. Some were planted over with trees and turned into pine forest. Some were buried under new Israeli settlements. Biram was turned into a national park and its land given to the nearby, newly formed kibbutz Baram. After the war, the Palestinians found that they had almost ceased to exist in their own land. Close to 700,000 Palestinians were made homeless. Only 150,000 remained in what became the State of Israel. It was the largest single exodus in Palestinian history, a Nakba, a catastrophe. For the next 18 years, they were forced to live under Israeli martial law, cut off from each other and excluded from Israeli society, confined to whatever was left of their cities, towns, and villages. In an attempt to erase their heritage, to erase the name Palestinian from their vocabulary, they became known as the Arab Israelis. The Christian population was particularly hard hit. More than a third of all Palestinian Christians were driven from their homes. Close to 60,000 fled to other countries. 30,000 became internally displaced. In June 1967, war jitters were being felt throughout the region. But Palestinians in the West Bank, living under Jordanian rule, never expected what came next.
On the 4th of June, there wasn't a single soldier. I'm talking about Jordanian army. They were all gone. Somehow, we were not in a war mood. Jordan already said that the West Bank was not defensible and that they have an agreement with the Israelis. So we thought that we will be a little bit protected.
On the morning of the 5th of June, Palestinians awoke to a new reality as the news of the attack spread like wildfire amid shock, confusion, and misinformation. Israel's surprise attack on the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria lasted 6 days. Israel conquered Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, and the Syrian Golan Heights.
I was an undergraduate at the American University of Beirut. For about 2 weeks, I couldn't get in touch with my family. I heard indirectly that our house was being shelled or bombed and that my family died. So we stood in line at the Red Cross trying to get any kind of information, and we couldn't. And finally, it was my parents had found a way to send us a message that they were alive. The house was shelled, but the family was alive.
At Birzeit College, a Christian-founded university in the West Bank, students were taking their final exams when the news of the Israeli attack arrived. Parents started calling, asking to send their children back.
We prepared a bus to take the students to Jerusalem. And lo and behold, the bus came back. They couldn't reach Jerusalem. Already the Israeli army was there.
Everyone who was outside the country when the war broke out was barred from returning home, even if it meant separating children from their parents, sometimes for years.
I couldn't go home. The Israelis wouldn't let me come back. And they told my father he had applied repeatedly for family reunion because I was outside in 67, so they decided I had no right to be there, even though my family goes back centuries. And they said she can come back, but we'll have to arrest her.
Bombed during the war, the Allenby Bridge still managed to transfer 400,000 more Palestinians out of their land, forcing them to join those who had been driven from their homes in 1948 and were still waiting to return.
While I was growing up, I thought it was the problem of the previous generation. They lost Palestine. It was their issue. They had to regain it. And after 67, this was a real turning point. And I felt now it's become my issue. Now it's my problem.
With every Israeli expansion, there was a new wave of refugees, new hard lessons to be learned, but also new forms of resistance emerged from the need to survive.
what we call sumud is the most important thing. You know, that follows the 1948 catastrophe. People realized that the most important thing is to stay in the country and take the hardship and not repeat the mistake of the past.
When I came back, I saw how the Israelis controlled every aspect of our lives, how there was no value to our lives, to our rights, in any way, shape, or form. I was arrested and I was tried. Christmas 1973.
Israel regularly forced schools and universities to close. Teaching became a struggle, and any gathering of more than 5 people was considered a demonstration and was forbidden by the occupation authorities.
The Intifada of 1987-88 did not come out of the blue and should not have surprised anybody because it was brewing. There were several mini intifadas, so to speak, protests and marches. And it was quite spontaneous because people suddenly, you know, felt this is it. The incident in Gaza, the shooting of the workers.
The first time I heard about what happened at Erez was sitting here in my home and watching the news. And it was a very painful scene that I really questioned inside me. That's something I shouldn't be silent about. But apparently many others have decided actively not to be silent about, because suddenly protests erupted everywhere.
It was a normal explosion, a genuine one. The people expressed normally, spontaneously their feelings. We want freedom, we want to live no more occupation.
The Intifada came to tell not just the Israelis, but the rest of the world. We were here, we are here, we will persist, we will remain, and we will get rid of this injustice, this occupation. And we are still saying it. How people felt that this was it. This was the watershed. This was the moment to get rid of the occupation. And that's why they called it the Intifada, the rising up and shaking off.
Beit Sahur, a predominantly Christian village near Bethlehem, also known as Shepherd's Fields of the Christmas story, became a leader in civil disobedience, a model of steadfastness.
So at that time we realized that the first step we need to do is actually democratize the society. And then it was the first thing that we did, and I think spread afterwards to the entire West Bank, and right now to Egypt and to Yemen, was establishing what was called the popular committees. And the popular committees were elected.
We had neighborhood committees. We taught underground. And when the army found us, they would shoot at us. And you could go to jail. They said 10 years for belonging to a neighborhood committee.
We sat together and we decided that what we need is actually to go into full civil disobedience where the occupation will not be able to run the place. And that would be the first major crack in the establishment itself, and that will make it much harder for the occupiers to rule over us.
But Beit Sahur was not going to be intimidated and abruptly refused to pay any more taxes to the occupation authorities. So the inhabitants of Beit Sahur gathered en masse in front of the municipality and threw away their ID cards.
We don't recognize your authority, therefore, this is your card. This card is a source of humiliation for us. That was very scary to the Israelis. In fact, they did a very weird and ugly procedure, which is arresting about 30 people and starting the process of deporting them, saying that without an identity card, you are illegally residing in this area. And then the idea was suggested, why don't we stop submitting monthly reports? Because, you know, you are paying taxes and you are not receiving services. No taxation without representation. I'm not going to pay taxes except for my elected government.
The Israeli authorities took the matter very seriously, not only for fear that peaceful civil disobedience would spread, but also because the occupation had become a profit-making endeavor. The Palestinians have had to put up with the most imaginative taxes: the glass tax for broken glass, the stone tax for damage done by stones.
They confiscated households, machinery from manufacturers, goods and medicine from groceries. I mean, at some homes, they left only dust. Like they took appliances, kitchen appliances. They even confiscated the bed you sleep on.
The plight of Beit Sahur made it all the way to the United Nations.
Due legal process must be followed. There can be no excuse for the illegal and arbitrary confiscation of furniture and household belongings and of the machinery which provides the livelihood for small business people. We've expressed our serious concern to the Israeli authorities, and we call for an end to the blockading of Beit Sahur.
Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin decided to make an example of the unruly Christian town of Beit Sahur.
Rabin was very fearful about this and actually took it personally. He said, I'm going to teach them a lesson, and actually sieged the town, 8 days of total curfew, 45 days of total siege, nothing enters, nothing go out. Now, we were ready to that period, and this is what made them more furious.
Despite the hardship, morale in Beit Sahur was high. Images of Israel's mighty army fighting stone-throwing youth spread throughout the world. Israeli soldiers killed more than 1,000 Palestinians during the First Intifada. In Beit Sahur, Israeli forces targeted young activists, killing 3 teenage boys in the space of a year. Rula Rishmawi was only 13 years old at the time.
كانوا هم أصحاب. الأول كأنه لما غلط الجندي ورمى عليه الحجر فأجا في راسه فاستشهد. الثاني كنا إحنا دائما بعد يوم الأحد بعد الكنيسة كانوا كل البنات والشباب في بيت سحور يطلعوا المظاهرة، بنحط الحجار وولعوا العجال وكل هاي الأشياء. أجا الجيش طبعاً كلنا يعني لما أجا الجيش كلنا شردنا، بس هو كان قدامي وأنا وراه. بس أنا سمعت لما هم طخوه، يعني حسيت إنه كيف أجت في جسمه. فهو لما يعني انطخ صار يحكي أنا انطخيت. أنا من الناس اللي شردت وراه، فوقع على الأرض. فأنا يعني مش عارف شو بدي أسوي لأنه الجيش ورانا، حملناه 2 حملناه، فدخلناه على بيت وأنا بلشت ألاحظ إنه هو يعني هو بيموت قاعد. أنا لاحظت هذا الإشي لأنه صرت أسأل ليش هيك بيعمل. فلما حطوه في البيت طبعاً يعني أنا شفت لما مات، بس ما كانت أول مرة في حياتي بشوف واحد بيموت، فما عرفتش إنه هذا يعني مات، بس أنا شفته لما مات.
Another boy was shot point blank as he was walking down the street.
الثالث كان هو نشيط سياسي، فكانوا هم بدهم إياه، يعني لازم بيسموه إنه بدهم يصفوه، يعني يتخلصوا منه. فكان هو في الشارع هون عندنا وراه، فعلى طول يعني هم كانوا لابسين عادي، زينا يعني الجيش بيلبس بنسميهم مستعربين، يعني بيلبس زي العرب، زي كيف احنا بنلبس. فعلى طول سألوه شو اسمك، لما جاوب أنطوني الشوملي حط الفرد هون في معدته وطخه.
The signing of the Oslo Peace Accords marked the end of the First Intifada. The peace process should have eventually brought peace. But peace didn't come. And while the rhetoric of peace filled the news, facts on the ground proved otherwise. During the so-called Oslo years, Israel oversaw the doubling of the settler population in the West Bank.
They accepted the Oslo agreements, and the Oslo agreements mean you put yourself in the mouth of the lion.
Unfortunately, Israel did not respond in kind. They did not understand the language of reconciliation or the requirements of justice and peace. They thought they could have their cake and eat it too. They could use negotiations as a cover, and they could persist with their own measures of building more settlements, stealing the land.
All the land, the one land, is now divided into 3 areas, A, B, C. Even in the first part where the Palestinians are supposed to be free, they are no more free. The Israelis go inside every time they want. And with all this interruption between the areas, no more freedom of movement.
They just wanted a process. But in the meantime, they were doing everything possible to negate the very substance of that process, which is peace, land for peace.
We cannot say they are not serious because they have their aims. They want all the land. Now it is very clear, very evident, they want all the land without Palestinians. Conflicts will not finish, even if the Palestinians are tired and so on. The Israeli, if they want peace, they have to see that the Palestinians have also peace. Both must have peace. One cannot have peace. One alone cannot have peace.
In September 2000, Ariel Sharon, Israel's opposition leader at the time, toured the Muslim Haram al-Sharif, which Jews call the Temple Mount, escorted by hundreds of heavily armed police. His provocative actions instantly became a religious affront, igniting the Second Intifada. Bethlehem, like other towns in Palestine, wasn't spared the bloodshed. The worst came in the early spring of 2002, when Israeli forces stormed into Bethlehem. Around 200 Palestinians, fighters and civilians, sought shelter in what has always been a place of refuge, a church. But this was no ordinary church. It was the place where Jesus was born, marked by the Church of the Nativity. Nearby, Pastor Mitri Raheb's church and his congregation were trapped in the crossfire.
You will see that all of the clashes were happening mainly around this church. And so often on a Sunday, I had actually to stop preaching because the shooting behind these walls was so loud that no one would hear me if I have continued.
Israeli soldiers set up camp around Claire Anastasis's house and would come in whenever they wanted.
We were like surrounded with soldiers, military, tanks, everything. Because the soldiers used to occupy midnight most of the time. It was really awful.
Just as the Church of Nativity was besieged by the Israeli army, so were the inhabitants of Bethlehem. Occasionally, the Israeli forces would allow residents to leave their houses and buy supplies, but not Claire and her family.
They caged us 40 days as they caged people inside the Nativity Church under the siege, when the siege time. And we were starving for 40 days and nobody took care of us or did anything for us.
We spent like 40 days under curfew, almost 24/7. And for me, it was a shock that really, most of the Christians abroad were silent when it comes to the little town of Bethlehem. You know, they like to sing about the little town of Bethlehem in the churches on Christmas Eve. But I felt at that time that actually Bethlehem was abandoned.
After the siege, Israel began to build the wall, an imposing 8-meter-high concrete barrier throughout the West Bank and around Bethlehem. Israeli officials claimed the wall was designed to keep suicide bombers from reaching Israeli towns and cities.
During the Second Intifada, Israel started building this wall of separation, which made the little town of Bethlehem as little as 4 square miles.
And one day, when the children went to school, they returned back, they find this wall surrounded our house. It was raining day, and they saw a high ghost around the house. And they went up quickly with the tears and cried.
Once located on the biblical road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, near Rachel's tomb, Claire's apartment had the best view of the city. In a matter of hours, her house was transformed into a tomb. The view from her windows was wall-to-wall gray cement slabs.
For a while, I just felt that there's no hope. At the same moment, actually, when they put the walls, when I saw my children crying, I thought to go down and kill the soldiers. That's what I felt. Even we are Christian, we should love our enemies. Of course, I will never do it. My youngest son, his name is Daniel, he was the only one who could speak at that moment. And he said, Mom, after what we lived with and after what we suffered and borne, and we lived in a horrible life for many years, this is the end, is to bury us alive in a big tomb forever? Actually, I couldn't answer him or speak one word. I just hugged them and cried.
When it comes to Israel, all rules change. And I think many churches, unfortunately, don't have the courage. It's not only the churches, it's also many countries in the world. They don't have the courage to speak truth to power when it comes to Israel.
The new harsh reality was a sudden divorce after centuries of close interaction. The people of Bethlehem had always been able to move freely between their town and Jerusalem. Not anymore.
Jerusalem and Bethlehem were always like one town, one city. And related one to the other, attached. The separation of Bethlehem and Jerusalem is not normal. In one aspect, Jerusalem is open to all the world. In the other aspect, Jerusalem is closed to its own inhabitants. They need military permits. They are given on the occasion of their feasts. But we say it is not normal also to have permit in order to reach the holy places. We should have the right to reach the holy place without any military permit.
Not only are families in Bethlehem and Jerusalem separated from one another, but also within Bethlehem itself.
My father-in-law family lives just some meters from here. Like the son and the father lived in the same street, and they put the borders just in the middle, in between us.
Whatever the reasons for the Israeli wall, the net result has meant greater oppression for the Bethlehem area, where a majority of Palestinian Christians live.
The occupation is oppressing everybody, and it is doubly oppressing the Christians.
The largest concentration of Christians in the West Bank today is in and around Bethlehem. So we have actually almost half of all Palestinian Christian community of the West Bank living in this area.
In a conflict where control of the land is key, Loss of that land is driving many to abandon their ancestral homeland in despair.
Christians are there, they should have the space to go on living, not to emigrate. Because this is also one of the reasons for emigration, when they have no more space to live, to build, etc.
If they will continue building these walls around the city, the holy city of Bethlehem, there's no life. They would leave. And I'm sure we will lose the Christians.
To live in the shadow of the wall, to feel all the time that actually your best land, prime land of Bethlehem, is put on the other side of the wall. You know, it mainly belonged to Palestinian Christian families. We have 1,835 Palestinian Christian families whose land is put on the other side of the wall, and which means they cannot access it anymore. They cannot go to pick up the olives. It has nothing to do with security. It's a land grab.
We are all Palestinians, and we are all in the same boat. There is no distinction for occupation. Occupation is one for Muslims and Christians. And for the Israeli, we are all Palestinians. So there's no distinction. Some would like to make distinctions in order to separate between Muslim and Christian, but it is useless. It is not for the good of no one. The good of any people is to remain one.
I personally think that actually Israel would like to have the Holy Land without Christians, because then they can sell this conflict being a Jewish-Muslim conflict as a religious conflict. We as Christians, we say this is not a religious conflict. This is a political conflict.
I am seriously concerned about the fact that the Christians have diminished in number, that the Christians are not only leaving Palestine, but are being forced in many ways to leave. That Palestine is losing its flavor, its pluralistic, tolerant, inclusive nature and identity. It's very important that the churches, the different places, all the Christian locations do not just become archaeological sites or museums. The living aspect of Christianity in Palestine is disappearing. And that's why I think it's very important that we restore it, that we try to maintain it, that we encourage its continuity, not as a symbolic presence, but as a very human presence, because we are part of the real history, the authentic history and continuity of Palestine. We used to get some of the evangelical preachers or Jehovah's Witnesses and so on that come to my mother's house. And she'd say, you came all the way from the States to preach to me about Jesus, who was my next door neighbor. This is where he lived. We should tell you about Christianity.
The Palestinian Christian community is a very special community because this is where it's all started. If you come here to look for the risen Lord among the dead, in the stones, in the shrines, he is not there. He is living in his community. there you can meet him. And so basically, don't come just to run where Jesus walked, but come to meet the living stones. Those are the Christians that keep that message that Jesus started 2,000 years ago. They keep that message alive today.
Numbers are used and misused. Percentages become politics. Wars and closures, walls and sieges have resulted in a steep decline in the number of indigenous Christians. Today, there are only 170,000 Palestinian Christians left in what was once historic Palestine. In their daily lives, their traditions and their customs, the Christians of Palestine weave the past with the present, forming an unbroken chain from the time of Jesus until today. They are proud to be born in the land of Jesus, to walk the same roads, the same hills, the same valleys that he and his disciples walked, the land where Christianity was born. Their many churches, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, form a beautiful mosaic of practices. Every year they commemorate the events of Jesus' life in the places where they happened. Often forgotten, they are the living witnesses of a vibrant faith and a rich heritage.